I was born in April of 1995. I'm just a few months younger than the Sega Saturn and Sony PlayStation, which both saw their first releases in fall of 1994. I never even really lived in a world where games weren't very entrenched in the third dimension. Jumping Flash came out literally the day after I was born. The first console I ever owned was a Nintendo 64. The first game I played for it was Super Mario 64. I myself never really had to make the awkward transition from the second dimension to the third dimension as a player. And perhaps because of that reason, I find this era really fascinating in gaming's history. The early 3D games of the late 90s were awkward, clunky, and I think there's a general consensus that they're very hard to return to with the modern eye, but honestly, I kinda like the roughness around the edges of late 90s 3D games. I find it really interesting to see how hard it was for games to stumble into a comfortable place in the third dimension, especially with the relatively limited capabilities of the platforms at the time. And I feel that few game genres were as adept at using the limitations of the PlayStation, Saturn, and Nintendo 64 to their advantage the way that survival horror games were. It's no coincidence that this era produced so many classic horror games. Resident Evil in 1995, House of the Dead in 1996, Nightmare Creatures in 1997, Silent Hill in 1999. Some of the most effective generic traits in survival horror can be linked to the limitations of the time. Your player character's weaknesses, off-putting scenery and enemies, the environmental storytelling, they all, to an extent, have their original place in the struggles and limitations of the late 1990s. These are all very accurately played up in back in 1995, a survival horror adventure developed and released by Tokyo-based independent developer Takaaki Ichigo. Back in 1995's dedication to the aesthetic evoked by its name is commendable. When one thinks of the aesthetic of survival horror games from the mid-90s, the adjectives which come to mind generally aren't really positive in connotation. Your textures are muddy, your music is repetitive, your sound effects are jarring, unnatural, your character models are kinda jagged and kinda tough to look at, the enemies even more so. Your scenery is kinda generic, the camera angles feel arbitrary and even obfuscating at moments. But putting that whole package together actually pays off back in 1995. The muddy, repeated textures on the floors and walls, distorted even further by the game's default CRT filter, actually add to this sense of palpable dread, which I think really defines the game's whole mood. It feels so dreary, kind of unnatural even, and the fact that the walls and floors seem to warp as the player character walks over them adds to that even more. There are even some loose and kind of rare camera glitches that make the whole thing seem very eerie and unnatural. It reminds me of those little details in the Petscop web series, where this fictional PlayStation game can do all these things which, logically, a PlayStation would never be able to accomplish. And that's what back in 1995 really feels like, a Saturn game that I picked up off a card table at a flea market, from a stack of discs in one of those generic cases you can get at Office Max. A game I pick up and wonder, if this game is haunted and I get killed by some kind of poltergeist within, I could understand it. The way that these enemies are designed is also pretty significant. I've always had this weird phobia of low-polygon game monsters. I think it must have started for me with the piano in Big Moo's Haunt in Mario 64, and it has manifested time and time again for me. There was the Flood in Halo, the head crabs in the first Half-Life, basically any of the enemies in Doom 3. I think it's the unnatural way that they moved mixed with the way that my brain immediately thinks of what it would look like if those low polygon models were to physically manifest on the floor and nibble right at my little feet. I've had precisely that thought, and that is precisely why I haven't ever played past the first hour of the first Half-Life. Anyway, these ones are kind of freaky too. Not bad enough to make me stop playing, but they get a little bit of that spine tingle going, and they get my toes curling up in my shoes, just making sure nothing's nibbling at my little feet. The ones you encounter early on lumber in this really strange way. There are a few which stick out of the floor, which I also don't care for obvious reasons. But that's something that early low-polygon games can communicate, which a modern, gory horror game just wouldn't. The monsters in the 2016 Doom game, for example, look like they could be real, and that's scary, but these guys I know couldn't be. And that's what makes them so unnaturally freaky when I imagine them in the real world hiding under my desk just ready to nip right at my little feet. The office in this game is as nondescript as any office I've ever been to in a game. I've played games where the office was supposed to be thematically nondescript, and they don't really hold a candle to just how nondescript and generic the offices in back in 1995 are. They're so perfectly nondescript that it makes this whole situation kind of existentially horrifying. Like, this is what we're saving? These identical cubicle farms and this barren kitchen and this vending machine are worth fighting for? Your character's just a normal person, a pretty nondescript guy, and heroism basically grabs him by the collar and drags him into the fold. But it's all on this cynical, hopeless, off-white, mid-90s cubicle farm. It's like, oh, I guess this is all that there is. But the one thing I think back in 1995 gets most accurate in the recreation of a mid-90s survival horror game is actually the positioning and angling of the game's camera. The camera is fixed in place, like a CCTV security camera would be. And once your character moves out of range, there's a sudden switch to another angle. This can leave enemies obscured, can make it hard to navigate spaces. Like, for instance, there's a specific incident where I just didn't know there was another hallway to take out of a room because the camera made it look like the side walls went all the way to the back. And at points it's annoying, which at least is accurate. But at other points it feels unintentionally beautiful, downright cinematic. You'll happen across these shots which a more intuitive camera design just would never give you. It sneaks up on you. You'll be in the middle of a fight, and all of a sudden you'll think, wow, I never would have thought that I'd see this from this angle. Or you'll be walking from place to place on one holding shot, and it'll hit you just how alone you are in your bleak little adventure. And the audio really serves to push loneliness in your face as well. The music is minimal if it's there at all, and it's so minor that it slips quietly into the background with all the other aspects of life. The air conditioner whirring, the dishwasher running, your upstairs neighbors yelling at each other on their porch. And it doesn't make anything work really cleanly. I only really thought about it when I was thinking, wait, how many times has this looped? Its nondescriptness kind of matches the nondescript workplace in which you experience it, and that does kind of make you feel isolated and unimportant, which is kind of a terrifying concept to think of through your character's eyes. This is probably the scariest thing ever to happen to him, and yet it doesn't seem to matter that much. But the thing that really gets to me about the audio, and this is something evocative of the era, is how you can hear every footstep that the character takes. It's a constant clop, 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 kind of droning, kind of hypnotic, and it makes you feel like a bit of an intrusion into this world. It's silence, quiet, creepy music, and you. Nothing else makes the amount of constant noise that you do. It makes you feel like you shouldn't be there. God, I've said that before with this game, haven't I? Feels like there are just a couple of themes which keep coming back in 1995, and I need to list them out before I go too far. So without further ado, the three themes which keep coming back up. 1. You are alone. In narrative, you have only one or two allies, but they literally do not move from their positions. You are the only one with any level of power to do anything, and you have to do everything. The enemies trying to kill you are many, and you're within a building full of echoes of a once lively corporate setting, but you are alone. And you're constantly reminded of that through the things I've touched on. Camera angles, how generic the player character is, for example. Notice that I've made it all the way here into the video before stating his name, because I don't need to, though it is Kent. 2. You are not important. This is the delicious paradox of back in 1995. You are the most important character in the narrative, but everything in the world seems to make you seem so unimportant. Kent's character, or relative lack thereof, exemplifies this. Kent's entire mission here in the narrative is kicked off because the scientist who actually can connect you with the other people of relative import is too old and feeble to walk downstairs and get some files himself. You get the sense that Kent himself doesn't really matter, and that this story could be about any person with a name that a man in his 30s has. Jeff, Richard, Horace, pick a name. Doing precisely what Kent's doing. 3. All this should not be. This game should not exist. I played it on an Xbox One, a console upon which one can play a version of the original Resident Evil with all the faults fixed. Kent should not be there. Everything, even his allies to an extent, are hostile towards him, and his footsteps are loud as hell, messing with the natural atmosphere. The situation should not be happening. This is like a fairly benign operation they were running there. Maybe I missed a note card or something, but a lot of the environmental storytelling is very bland. Like, hey, if you want to get into my briefcase, here's the code. And this is who we've hired to clean up the kitchen. And we're getting the walls cleaned next week, and some scaffolding has been set up. There's a reference to terrorism at one point, but it's not clear if there was an incident that affected the building you're in. It's like you're just not supposed to be there, and the story told in this game wasn't supposed to be told, maybe due to some creepy elements, but maybe also due to the fact that shit wasn't that important in the scheme of things. And that's what I really liked about this game. Paradoxically, it gets those gameplay elements right. Like, Kent walks backward at a glacial pace, so when you get in a fight with an enemy, you have to take into account the fact that you're not going to be able to escape. That's kind of scary, but I think it's just the fact that this game feels like so inconsequential. And that's something I don't think you get out of gaming that often. And that's kind of horrifying in its own right. It goes against what you would expect out of a protagonist-driven story. Kent is barely important to the world in which he lives. He's truly forced to survive here, and you as the player feel that. There's a reluctancy, a terror, and a survival, which defines this relatively short but still very affecting thematic throwback. If anything, back in 1995 has pushed me to reconsider the way that I approach game criticism. This game is heavily flawed, but in all the ways that make it feel right for me. It's pushed me to look critically at the philosophy I take to games, because truthfully, back in the days when I brought a kind of mechanical or objectivist approach to my understanding of games, I feel that I probably would have dismissed back in 1995 whole cloth. I could understand a younger me viewing those stiff controls, the fixed camera angles, the minimal story, all of that as reasons for me to disdain this game, but something's changed in me, and I'm glad that it has. This game is indicative of why I don't call what I make reviews anymore, and I don't give out scores or ratings or anything. I don't think a number could do my experience with back in 1995 justice, and I don't think a scale from good to bad could do that either. When I look at this game on the Steam store, it has relatively bad reviews, and I can understand that. And I understand a lot of the complaints that reviewers have with it. I just find it indicative of a difference in philosophy between others and myself. So now I guess I've got to go work on figuring out just what that means.
It's been quite difficult for me to find a way to actually satisfyingly finish this video, particularly because I know that much of what I said in the first part of this video completely shifts at the midway point in the game in a way that I find very satisfying. So satisfying, in fact, that I actually don't want to really give it away. So I'm just going to recommend that if something like this thematically you feel would affect you, something that really makes an effort to thematically mirror the games of the late 1990s while at the same time using that as sort of a force to push it forward in your mind, and you can look past kind of the mechanical faults that are sort of baked right into the crust there, I really recommend Back in 1995 as an experience. But as a game, the flaws are still there, so I can imagine I can imagine a lot of ways that one person would look at this. You can look at this as mechanically not a great game, and if you want to analyze it on that like GamePro, fun factor scale from the late 1990s, you wouldn't be giving this the exploding head of joy 5.0 out of 5 on that scale, but I think as a full experience, it's a really affecting one if you're kind of inclined to look at games the way that I do. So in a way, I both, I guess, recommend and don't recommend, and for that reason really recommend that viewers try out Back in 1995. And I don't know how to end this video.